Today we're going to continue with fallacies of logic. Please make sure that your mic is off, your camera is off, you have a piece of paper and a pencil or pen ready. You can also do it in a Google Doc, of course, and send me those notes. So with no further ado, hold on just 1 second, apparently a little bit further ado, because I realized I have an extra slide in here. I would like to continue to remind you that I will be sending something to the houses or house of the students of the week. This is based on attendance, best and most complete answers on LSAE work, and participation in class. Next week, you only have school on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. That means you have April 30th and May 1st off. So congratulations to you guys. We have 2 more days of school this week. Next week, you just have 3 days of school. Questions, please put them in the chat box. So on your note card, I would like you to take 1 minute and write today's objective in your own words. Students will be able to identify false analogy and straw man fallacies. Pause the video, you have 1 minute now. All right, you guys, so please make sure that it says false analogy and straw man. These are 2 more fallacies of logic we're going to learn about today. So you're gonna have 2 minutes to answer the following 2 questions. First of all, what is a fallacy of logic? So your sentence starter is, a fallacy of logic is. And what fallacies of logic have we already learned about? We have already learned about ... Pause the video. You have 2 minutes to complete this. Go. All right, you guys. So a fallacy of logic is a flaw in an argument. And we've learned about a lot of different types of fallacies of logic so far. So we've learned about ad hominem fallacies. That's where someone is calling someone else a name. So rather than answering the question they were asked, they try to divert the attention of the person who they're arguing with by calling them a name. Yeah, well, you're stupid, or, well, that's dumb anyway, right? Generalization. A generalization is if you say, for instance, all people with curly hair are really smart because you know one person that has curly hair that's really smart, right? So you take a small sample population and you turn it into everybody who looks that way or acts that way is the same. That's a generalization. False causality, we talked about it on Tuesday. False causality is saying that one thing caused another thing. So for instance, because I painted my nails blue and because I drank a soda today, my soda tasted really bad because of my blue nail polish, right? The soda didn't taste bad because I painted my nails. It's something else, but it's putting 2 things together that don't make sense and saying one caused the other. Red herring is trying to distract someone by saying something totally random, right? So these are the 4 that we've learned so far. Today we're going to learn about a couple that are kind of similar, so it starts to get a little trickier as we go on. We're going to learn about false analogy and straw man fallacies of logic. So please make sure you're taking notes as we go along. Let's start with our 5th fallacy of logic. It's false analogy. As you know, an analogy is something that compares 2 things. So in an analogy, you'll always have 2 things being compared. But in a false analogy, the 2 things that are being compared are not alike. Here's another way of saying that. Many arguments rely on an analogy between 2 or more objects, situations, or ideas. If the 2 things that are being compared aren't really alike in relevant ways, the analogy is a weak one. And the argument that relies on it commits to the fallacy of weak or false analogy. So just so you know, sometimes you'll see weak analogy, sometimes you'll see false analogy. Those 2 things for our purposes today are the same thing. A weak analogy is a false analogy. Here's an example. Noisy children are a real headache. An aspirin will make a headache go away. Therefore, an aspirin will make noisy children go away, right? So we have 2 things that are being compared here, 2 things that create a headache. We have noisy children and we have a headache. And they're saying since both things are noisy, apparently one will make the other one go away. Does this make sense? It does not. A false analogy fallacy is based on comparing two things that don't make sense. Let's take a look at another example. Here we have a penguin that says, penguins are black and white. Some old TV shows are black and white. Therefore, some penguins are old TV shows. On your note card, I would like you to pause the video and tell me in a full sentence, why is this a false analogy? Go. Okay, you guys. So obviously, penguins and old TV shows are being compared here because they're both the same color. But that does not mean that a penguin is an old TV show just because they share the same colors. This is a false analogy that things being compared are not similar. Here's another example. It says, why do you care if I smoke a cigarette every night, Mom? You have a piece of dark chocolate every night, so what's the big deal? In the chat box, I would like you to tell me what are the things being compared and why is this a false analogy? Take 1 minute, pause the video, go over to our chat box and answer. Okay, welcome back. So the two things being compared is smoking a cigarette and eating a piece of dark chocolate. Are cigarettes and dark chocolate the same? They're both bad for you, right? But one is significantly worse, you could argue, than the other. Smoking a cigarette does not have the same effect on your body as eating a piece of chocolate, right? Cigarettes are worse. Here's another one, super random. If I had a bowl that was filled with 10,000 M&Ms, but I told you that 10 of them were deadly poison, would you eat a handful? That's the first part of the analogy. The second one says, this is how I feel about Syrian refugees. So people from Syria that came here looking for refuge, looking to become part of the United States. So this is a weak analogy because they're saying, this is a little more complicated. This is college stuff, you guys. They're saying if there were 10,000 people and 10 of them were deadly, this is how I feel about Syrian refugees. So even if we let in 10,000 people and 10 of them were dangerous, it wouldn't be safe for our country. It's a weak political analogy. Again, if this doesn't make sense to you, just let it roll off your back. This is college stuff. Here's another example. Guns are like hammers. They're both tools with metal parts that could be used to kill someone. And yet it would be ridiculous to restrict the purchase of hammers. So restrictions on purchasing guns are equally ridiculous. I would like you to turn and talk to the person next to you. It can also be your cell phone, and tell them why this is a weak analogy. Pause the video, go. Okay, you guys, this is an analogy that people like the NRA, the National Rifle Association, they like to make these kinds of analogies. They say, well, a gun could kill someone, but so could a hammer. Why should we not be able to sell guns? Of course, guns are much more dangerous. Hammers and guns are not analogous. They are not alike enough to compare to one another. So now it's your turn. If you think about it, you can make an analogy of some kind between almost two things, any two things in the world. Here's an example. My paper is like a mud puddle because they both get bigger when it rains, right? So I would like you to draw an analogy, a false analogy between two things, any two random things on your note card. They will have something in common, but the two of them are not alike enough, like paper and a mud puddle, right? Those two things are not alike, but they have something in common. So put on your green caps, your creativity hats, pause the video. You have 2 minutes to write a false analogy on your note card. Go. All right, you guys, I really look forward to reading your notes today to see what you came up with. So now we're moving on to the next fallacy of logic, which is called straw man. There are some different ways to define this. So one definition says that a person sets up a weak or a wimpy or a different version of their opponent's argument, then they take that argument down. They knock the argument down. So instead of addressing an argument, you misrepresent the argument so it seems poor or ridiculous. Then you address the argument that you created. You create a straw man to fight against instead of fighting the real thing. And that's why it's called a straw man. So instead of, if there was a real person behind it, instead of fighting that real person, you're creating a straw man in front of it to knock it down, because it's much easier to defeat a weak or a wimpy version of an argument than the real thing. So let's take a look at some examples. Please write this in your notes if you don't already have it. There will be a quiz coming up in a couple weeks. Here's another way to think about straw man fallacies. It's giving the extreme version of someone else's arguments rather than the actual argument they made. This often involves putting words into someone else's mouth by saying they made an argument that they didn't actually make. So sometimes people will say that, right? You put words in my mouth. And that's a straw man argument when someone is trying to change the argument to a weaker argument and then defeat that argument. Let's take a look at some examples. The straw man in politics. We see this all the time, you guys. This is a frequent way that politicians sidestep uncomfortable topics when put on the spot. You'll watch any debate and you'll see plenty of examples of this. So here's one example. This happened recently. Sir, could you comment on the New York Times report that you blah, 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 right? So it's saying maybe you deserve to be impeached. Obviously, we're talking about Donald Trump here. Maybe it was that you didn't deal with the coronavirus for the entire month of February. Sir, what would you say about that? And Donald Trump's response was, the failing New York Times sucks and is fake news. Sad. So we see here, this could also be ad hominem, right? They're using insults instead of addressing the real argument, but that could also be a straw man fallacy. So there's, instead of addressing the real issue, they're putting something, a weaker, more distorted version of the argument in front of the real argument, that straw man, and knocking that down instead. Let's look at some more examples. People who don't support the proposed state minimum wage increase hate the poor. So we have a minimum wage. Right now it's only $7 an hour, but people make this minimum wage, and the argument is people who don't support increasing that amount must hate poor people. In this example, the author attributes the worst possible motive to the opponent's position. In fact, it's probably much more complicated than that, but if they make it that simple, then they're able to knock down that argument easier, right? They're saying they hate poor people. And they're like, hold on, that's not even what we're talking about, right? So they weaken their argument and they knock down that weak argument. So now you're going to return to the classwork section of our Google Classroom. You're going to complete today's DOL. You'll have 7 minutes to do so. I will show you now where that is. So you're going to come here to Thursday, April 23rd. Click on our DOL, false analogies and straw man fallacies. True or false, picture, question, picture, question. Please let me know when you are finished. I will let you know what your grade is, and we will complete our LSAE work together. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will see you back in the chat shortly. Bye, guys.